Okay, we returned from
Yeah, how can we
recess?
approve that one and not?
And at this time, we call the meeting back to order. At this time, we're going to adjourn. I move that the City Council be adjourned for today, and then we go directly into workshop. Heard the motion, been properly seconded. Are there any questions? No questions. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Motion carries. Manager?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, thank you. We have an important issue to discuss today in workshop. As you know, last year we came out of almost a 3-year drought, and that caught the attention of city officials and residents here in the community. And through our public engagement process, we heard from a lot of residents that they were interested in us identifying alternatives for additional water sources and other ways to conserve water to move us forward as a community, so we have a more predictable water supply system, and both for residents as well as to encourage economic development. So staff has put in a significant amount of time into looking at options. Alan King is going to share with you the staff's work to date, and also outline where we believe we're headed from this point forward. Additionally, you'll have a brief presentation that will describe a committee sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce that looked at the same issue and wanted to provide you with some guidelines as you move forward on looking at water sources. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan.
Thank you, Mr. Manager. Good morning, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. Like the manager was saying, we came out of the drought. You tasked us with taking a fresh, comprehensive look at our water supply and our water plan, and part of that included conservation. So in conjunction with that, we also, as you are aware, reached out to the community to get a sense of what their priorities were. And when you look at these two results, you see that in the community survey priorities, water was out ahead. And with the ACT ICT priorities, water was also ahead on that. So we figured it was timely for us to come and bring this topic before council. So in our presentation, we're going to follow, basically we're going to talk about water conservation. We're going to talk about the Aquifer Storage Recovery Project to give you an update on that before we segue into other possible new water supplies, ASR being the most recent water supply that we worked on. When we look at water conservation, there's really a couple of different ways to look at water conservation. One is how much water do you save, and the other is the economics of it. Staff put together a very comprehensive economic model to model what kinds of conservation had what sorts of economic outcomes. And we came up with this model was actually vetted with economic experts and to be validated. And we believe that we have a really good sense of what kinds of conservation are good economic in an economic sense and what kinds hurt us economically. And essentially what you're talking about is the economic conservation or the economic value expressed as how late you can bring on new dollars and how much you have to worry about with lost revenue. So the former, when you look at this graph here, shows that gray dark line. That's demand continuing to increase as you go on into the future. The green line represents what our current demand is right now. If we continue on as we are, we continue to sell more water and we continue to increase our revenues. If, however, that orange line shows that we take a big dip in demand, we push demand below current levels, it takes us a while for us to recover demand-wise. But the good part of this is what this shows is that you also are able to push that new supply off into the future. There's a value to taking big-ticket items like that and pushing it off into the future. However, what we talked about was that demand, while you're down below that demand, there's that period represented in the black that's lost revenue. It takes a while for us to get the demand back up to there, and in the meantime, you're not selling the kind of water that you were before, and that's lost revenue. Because our fixed costs make up so much of our costs, smaller amount of it is variable costs, it has a real impact. And with some, anecdotally and historically, you'll see some communities that have done a really good job of conservation, But what they did it is in a way that harmed them economically, an example being the Denver area, where they were very successful in conservation and then had to come back and ask for a rate increase because the conservation was so successful. So we've done some work to look at what kinds of conservations are good and what kinds make sense economically in our planning. So really, there's two kinds of conservation. There's the conservation that we do as a program, ongoing, planned out to realize the economic benefits of reducing our future demands. And then there's that conservation that comes about as an emergency response. You all recall that you passed a drought response plan that was taking smoothed average of the levels in Cheney as a point that defined triggers where we put in place certain drought measures. Those are mandatory, forced conservation. I want to distinguish between that and the other kinds of conservation like our rebate program. But to talk about the forced conservation as a part of a drought response, thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about drought. Here in the Kansas area, we have a history of drought. This is a chart that was developed using proxy data going back to the year 800 AD. In history, you have to look at long periods of history to get some sort of sense of what's happened and what's possible. And you see those broad bands. Those are very long periods of severe drought, 40, 50, 60 years plus. You can see that in our history, you go back far enough, we have some really severe droughts. So it's not unreasonable for us to think about droughts, considering that we live in an area that it does have a history of droughts. So let's talk about what we mean by the different types of droughts. One way to measure the severity and length of a drought is by calling it either a 1% or a 2% drought. In a 2% drought, it means that there's a 2% chance that it's going to happen, means that you should expect it to happen twice in a 100-year period, every 50 years. But what does that look like to us practically? 1950s, that was a 2% drought, for anybody who might have done some reading or what have you on the 50s drought. If you look at our current water supplies as they would be available in a 2000 drought, that's the green and the orange bands representing Cheney and the Equus beds. As you can see where we're at right now with 2013, we could withstand a 2% drought. That orange, the top of that orange band is above the dashed line, which is the most we would use in any particular year. We're okay in a 2% drought all the way out to the year 2023. So if we want to look at risk, a 2% drought, we're in pretty good shape. But eventually, as demand increases, we're going to have to do something, because by the time we get to 2023, we will no longer be able to withstand a 2% drought. So what does that look like practically? What does a 2% drought look like? Well, if you want to look at what drought plan you folks put into place that staff would be following, if we found ourselves in a 2% drought, this is what it would look like as we enter into the various stages of the drought response plan. As you can see, stage 1, that was pretty much voluntary drought response measures. Stage 2, now we're starting to get into things that are starting to regulate people's behavior. We're going to require them to do restrict the number of days they could irrigate outside. Those are still fairly benign, relatively speaking, measures that we could put into place. And if we were to find ourselves in a 2% drought, we would be able to stay mostly in stage 1 and stage 2 with about a year's worth of time in stage 3. Stage 3 was when we did not allow any irrigation of lawns. People would lose their lawns. But you'd be in about a 2-year period of time. We wouldn't run out of water, but if we went through the drought response plan that's been approved, that would be the kinds of consequences of a 2% drought. 1% droughts, just like it sounds, it would happen once every 100 years. An example of a 1% drought would be the 30s drought, the Dust Bowl. If you look at where we are as far as water supply for a 1% drought, we went out of the ability to withstand a 1% drought back in 2011. We're already beyond what we could being able to withstand a 1% drought. what it looks like practically if we were to find ourselves in a 1% drought and to put into place our drought response plan. What you'd be looking at is much more time in stage 3, and we'd even spend some time in stage 4. Stage 4, as you recall, was the most severe response, and that included no outside watering, even if you have commercial interests in your outside watering. That means the golf courses would go dead. They would no longer be able to water. In addition to that, we would be requiring our citizens to reduce the amount of water they use inside their homes by 15%. We put in those severe conditions, though. The drought plan was a well thought out drought plan that you put in place. It does get us through a 1% drought, but it puts us into a much more serious posture in terms of the effects that it has on our customers. So that gives you kind of a sense on what kind of risk is associated with going ahead and having a water plan that's based on a 2% drought versus a water plan that's based on a 1% drought. This is what it looks like. So to give you some sort of an idea now, moving on to the other kinds of conservation, what we do ongoing, we put in place an internal conservation program. And it included different practices for the city. And bottom line is we saved over 20 million gallons. And of course, we have to pay for our water. We saved ourselves $75,000 in water bills. We have a good ongoing plan. This is going to be something that we're going to continue to do to continue that realization in reduced water, to continue those savings in our water bill. But also, perhaps as importantly, it positions ourselves as a leader in the community, saying that we're not just telling you what you need to do. We're showing you by example of what the city intends to do. We also had a 2013 rebate program that council directed us to do. It was funded in the amount of $1 million. It was for the year. It ended at the end of 2013, and we told you we'd come back and talk to you about some options going forward after that. We got a participation rate of about $431,000. So 2,718 participants, 3,805 devices. But we did realize a significant savings, even for that short period of time. We looked at 280 acre-foot. That's the equivalent of decreasing our annual demand at a rate of 25 million gallons a day. So that was significant, even though we only ran a half a year and had about 40-some% participation rate. It shows that the concept of the rebate program is a sound one, which is also borne out in our literature search as we looked at different rebates programs, what others were doing across the country. There's benefits of conservation. What you want to try to do is you want to try to find a conservation program that's good for the city and good for the customers. You want to try to fashion it in such a way by the decrease in demand and the timing of the decrease, ideally so you minimize your lost revenue. A good rule of thumb for that is if you can blunt future increases in demand, that's all good conservation. If you take a deep dip in your current demand, it's going to take you a while for demand growth for you to catch up, and during that time you're going to have lost revenue. That's not as attractive economically. We're looking to also look for those options for conservation that have the least impact on our citizens' lives. So mostly voluntary and incentivized is what we're looking at. And here's one thing to keep in mind, though, is the more successful we are in conservation, it does a couple of things. It introduces new risks for us. Number one is right now we have a lot of variability from year to year, and we've set our rates in such a way so that if we have a wet year and we have low water sales, we don't have to go out and immediately do an emergency rate increase. We take into consideration what an average year is, and then we look for a little bit lower than that. If we start conserving, it'll start pushing down on that margin, and we could find ourselves in a really low water sales year where we have to start once again thinking about emergency rate increases. Also, in the case of emergency drought measures, if you're already realizing some conservation through your conservation program, you'll have less available to you to get you out of trouble when you do start enacting the emergency drought measures. So we got to just kind of keep that in mind. In summary, we looked at a lot of different possible conservation options. We have the internal conservation program. You're looking at about a 0.14%, but that's one time only. We don't think that we'll get a 0.14% decrease in demand year after year after year. Pretty much we've realized that decrease, and now that just carries forward. The rebate program, that was a whopping 0.44% reduction, and we think that is ongoing, that you would be able to repeat that year after year. That's a pretty impressive number. But, we've got a lot of feedback from people on our rebate program, and we've had some folks say, it would be even more successful if you would increase the eligibility so that it is not just homeowners, it could be renters, it could be commercial properties. Talk about different sorts of fixtures, rain smart sensors on rain irrigation systems and the like. We've put together a modified rebate program, and we'd like to look at it as something that we would go ongoing. And when we do our estimates on how much it would cost to fund it and how much benefit we get a pretty wide range, $1.2 to $3 million annual cost, with a 0.68 to 1.67 ongoing year after year reduction in demand. That is a big enough spread that what we'd like to do is we'd like to take some of that money that was left over from your earlier $1 million commitment to the rebate program and spend another $450 million as a pilot to try this new modified rebate so that we have a better understanding of what the real costs are going to be and what the real benefits are going to be so that we can make some smart decisions about the kind of conservation we want to do. We looked at scholastic education. We look at targeted mailings. Those are kind of traditional. Those are the ones that people generally will look at as far as voluntary conservation programs. We wanted to put them here so we could show that we looked at them. But when you look at the return, the effectiveness, the water savings, they're so low that we figure that would be something perhaps in the future we look at adding to our more central parts of our conservation program. And then finally, there are two areas that when our research showed us that perhaps are even more effective than the rebate program. One is all things landscaping, xeriscaping, drip irrigation, buyback of turf, having different types of irrigation systems, changing standards on what we put in as far as plantings, irrigation done by private wells. That's probably huge. But we didn't even have enough information to know what that really looks like for the city. But we do think that the benefits that we would get, the conservation benefits, could be potentially huge. Staff would like to propose doing a study to get a better sense on how many more private wells can be drilled, because that's not water that competes with the city's water source. It's in a different, shallow, low-quality aquifer, and people are taking their own money and investing in irrigation wells, which takes them right off of the potable demand side. How much more can we depend on that? And what are the benefits of turf buyback programs and those sorts of things? We'd like to conduct a study to get a better understanding of what's possible and how we can put this into our ultimate conservation plan. Similarly, we think that there's a lot of possibility in industrial reuse, and I don't mean using sewer effluent. I mean the company taking their potable water that they take delivery of and using it over and over again, similar to what Spirit is doing right now with the potable water we're selling them. They are presently reusing it, even though we're in the process of talking to them about some other possible opportunities for reuse for them. We'd like to do a study to see what would be the possible yields and costs associated with this program. So what we're proposing to council is, in coming forward with a conservation program, we'd like to spend the money on the modified rebate program as a pilot, and we'd like to conduct these two studies so that we can have a better understanding of really what is the best kind of conservation program moving forward. So before I segue into new supply, am I talking way too fast trying to cram this in a half an hour?
We do have some questions.
Sure, yes.
And I guess one of the questions I have, you just said that the wells that we currently have, the individual wells, individual homes, it's coming from a totally different water supply. And so it doesn't touch the current water supply that we actually are using.
That's correct, sir. So
is it not as the ones that we're using for our homes is not as deep as the others?
What I meant by the not our competing with our water supply, what I meant by that was the Equisbeds aquifer up at the north of town. That's a different aquifer than the one we're talking about primarily on the west side in the sandy soils. It's shallower, it's lower quality water. but it's fairly abundant, and that's what you're seeing people drilling their shallow wells 50, 60, 70 feet to get at that water and irrigate their lawns instead of doing it with drinking water. And what we've been seeing is a history. We've got literally thousands of those wells that have been installed over the years, and each one of those that gets installed, they take that irrigation system off of the public water system and instead use that shallow water, and it doesn't compete directly with our needs that are supplied out of the Equus beds up north.
But this is only on the west side of town.
It's all over, but primarily on the west side where you have the sandy soils. That seems to be where there's more opportunity, but you have wells all over the city. It gets tougher as you go further east.
Councilman Vice Mayor?
Alan, when you're talking about this conservation and call it a couple of these slides where you get a point where it's too successful, where it would cost. I know Denver had this problem 10 years ago, whatever. I'm struggling with do we have information? I'm sure you do. What makes up our fixed costs versus variable costs that we can manage?
Yeah, fixed.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Fixed costs would be things like staff salaries, the cost to pay for debt, those things that we have to pay regardless of whether we produce 1 gallon of water or 1 billion gallons of water. It's really things that are fixed. Variable costs are things like electricity, amounts of chemicals. The more water you sell, the more those charges increase. A lot of our expenditures are in the fixed cost category. So, and that's true of almost every utility. That's why when you have a community that has a very wildly unexpected successful rebate program, and they significantly reduce their demands, then they have to go back to their ratepayers and say, wow, we got to sell at least this much water to cover those fixed costs, so we're going to increase the rates for you. What we're trying to do is we're trying to be smart in the way that we do our conservation. Conservation, if done smartly, is a very, very important part of our plan. It's absolutely essential, but we want to do it in such a way that we minimize the rate impacts to our customers.
I think the key word is smartly that you just said. That wouldn't be fun if 5 years from now we conserve so well that we have to ask the citizens for a rate increase that's above and beyond the already set discipline of a modified increase over time. Not sure how you get smartly doing that, but so it's basically the debt that the capital costs that we've already sunk in, that's already bonded, and your minimal operating expenses that are salaried and costs.
Yeah, those are good examples of fixed costs.
The one thing I would caution, if I may interrupt, there's two sides to the equation, of course, and as we get into looking at alternative water sources, conservation is probably still going to be your cheapest water source. So conservation, as Alan said, plays really an important role here. And the grand scheme that we're looking at, we will probably invest in conservation, maybe invest more than we normally would, in order to try to push that line of when you need to have the substantial capital costs for another water source. So.
Councilwoman Miller?
Thank you, Mayor. I don't know, maybe you're going to get to this a little later, so you can tell me if you want to postpone the answer, but I am getting besieged by inquiries about continuing the rebate program, and so conceptually I understand what you've presented here, but practically, can you say what that means? Does that mean rain barrels, we're going to continue a program for that at some point, or specific things? Do we know that yet, or we're still trying to figure that out?
Well, what we're proposing is all the things that the earlier rebate program had, but we would make it more people eligible to be able to get rebates on those. And we're looking at adding some additional things like smart irrigation systems and sensors things that could make a real difference in the amount of water people are putting down. So we've got a menu of options. Before we actually go forward with a decision from council on specifically what that rebate program would be, we'd make sure that we communicated to you and had a breakdown of what we thought we'd see from each one and get your blessing on it. But suffice it to say, we envision at least what we had, building on that with the kinds of things that would be eligible, and building on that by the sorts of people that would, properties that would be eligible.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Continue on now.
So we're about ready to talk about new water supplies, but we figured it would be a good idea for us to update you on the most recent new water supply that the city put in, and that's the ASR, the Aquifer Storage and Recovery Project. It's got a long history. It goes back to 1993 as part of the Integrated Local Water Supply Plan. The city's always had a water supply plan, actually a pretty good one, and it's about time for us to update it and to reflect the situation that we're in today. We looked at 2002. We did the phase one design. That's the first piece, the ASR 1, and it was completed in 2006. It did a lot of testing of concepts like, can you pull water out of the river? Can you treat it? Can you push it into the ground as a recharge credit? Did that plant. It was very successful, learned a lot from it. Then in 2009 we began phase 2 construction. But in 2010, we halted construction for a third-party review. That was when HDR took a look, and just to make sure that things seemed to be going in the direction that we anticipated and that we wanted them to go, with a restart in that year following recommendations from HDR and the Water Utilities Advisory Committee. It wasn't until 2013 that it was completed, and in 2013 we did the commissioning. Part of that delay was because there just wasn't water in the river during that drought in 11 and 12 for us to pull out and do the things we needed to do to prove that the plant worked. But we began actually operating it in 2013, and it did provide us with some real benefit in taking water and taking it to town and helping us with our situation with the drought that we were in. When you look at phase 1, it tested the technology. It consists of wells, intake. The design volume was 10 million gallons for 120 days a year, and it cost $38.9 million. That project was completed. ASR2, there was a lot of ASR2 that wasn't just additional new water, but it was replacing old infrastructure that needed to be replaced and upgraded and rehabbed. That was part of the cost. Here's an example. We replaced the electrical grid, which had become unreliable. We rehabbed and improved our well field. We had some access road work we had to do. We did build a new treatment plant and intake for $82.6 million. And what we look at is if you look at each of those categories, if you break it down between rehab and new supply, about $88 million of that total ticket was for rehab, things that had to be done anyway, and about $116 million was associated with getting new supply for the city. Current status of ASR is it meets our objective to provide a source of water, and it also helps us in our attempts to slow down the chloride migration, the salt, as it comes into the aqueous beds. It produces less than was originally estimated, and we've been doing some work to try to optimize that. Part of that has to do with the amount of days of the year the water is available in the river, and part of that has to do with how much water, with the number of wells that we currently have, we can actually push down into the ground. It does not provide a new water for us to meet anticipated drought needs, so that's why we're here today to talk to you about additional possible new water sources.
Hold on. Councilman Blueball.
Whenever you say produces less than originally estimated, could you give me some numbers as to what we thought it would do and what the actual performance is?
Yes, sir, I've got that information. So originally, we believed that, hold on a second here. Originally, we believed that we would get 11,000 acre feet of water a year. That was what was based on what best information was available at the time. The information that they had to work with, using those as assumptions, they planned on 11,000 acre feet a year. What we're finding is we're thinking we're going to actually get about 5,800 acre-feet, somewhere close to half of the original estimates. And like I say, that's based on how many days a year you actually have water in the river at the level that you're able to divert it. And when you have that water, how much of it can you actually push down into the ground with our recharge wells to be able to be used later. So we're looking at ways to see if we can't up the efficiency and up the amount, but as far as the assumptions on how often the water is available in the river, that's something that we don't have control over. So the numbers are 11,000, what was projected, and 5,800, what we think is maybe a more realistic number.
Do we know, I mean, I'm sure the days per year and all that have been the same, haven't they? Is it the lowering water table, or what's the other issues why they're only hitting 60% of their original forecast?
When you do these assumptions, you want to have a long history of reads to be able to look. You don't want to just take a few years. And the water gauge that was in place at the time that all this work was done, it's also the water gauge that measures the level in the river, and it keeps records going back a long time. That water gauge is what our actual water right is tied to. It's the controlling water gauge that tells us when we may take water out of the river through our water right. That water gauge represents a higher level than the water that's actually at our intake at the river. Since then, there's been a new water gauge that's closer to our intake, and when we look at that, we looked at that real hard when we started actually operating the treatment plant, and there was actually water in the river for us to take, and there seems to be a much stronger correlation between that newer water gauge and what we're actually seeing at the river. We don't have as much history, but based on the history we do have with that new water gauge, that's how we come up with a revised estimate of the number of days we'd have water available.
Whenever I first came on last year, they gave me a tour up there, and just trying to understand, they showed me how the intake could eventually be increased. Are you telling me that there's really no water there to increase that intake, that we're taking all we can? Am I understanding that right, or?
Yeah, the increase in the intake would not change the number of days that water was available. What it would change is how much water you could take out of the river when it was available. Instead of 30 million gallons a day when water is available, you could double that to 60 million gallons a day when water is available. So it's really a matter of rate, how much you can take per day, not so much about the number of days that the water's available.
All right, thank you.
Vice Mayor.
Alan, back on slide 19 and 20. So the first phase cost $39 million, phase one. Second phase, it included a lot of stuff, was $204 million. Is that about right?
It's your math is better than mine. It's the sum of those two numbers, 88 and 116.
Okay. So on the first phase, it was completed in 2006. Was that all bonded? Is that on a 15-year, 20-year bond? I mean, does that debt ever retire, or is that ongoing? Did we even finance it? I assume we did.
I would defer to the finance director. I can get that information for you. I know that some of the financing was handled through bonds, some through temp notes, and some of those temp notes will be replaced with bonds, I believe, this year or next year. But rather than try to give you incomplete or wrong information, I'll get that information for you, sir, and get it to you.
No more questions?
So that gives you an update of ASR. We do have in some of the options that we're going to present, one of them has to do with boosting yet more what we could get out of ASR, and we'll line it up with what other options we have. Just by way of background, normally we get about 60% of our water from Cheney and about 40% of our water from the wells up north. Now, what we've done is we've worked a deal with the Army Corps. The Cheney has a certain amount of volume, a freeboard, if you will, that is reserved for drought, or excuse me, for flood protection. They like to keep it empty so they can have water fill that up to prevent downstream flooding. Normally, they empty that so that there's zero in that. And then we have below that, we have our water level all the way to the bottom. That's what water is available to us. What we've done is we've cut a deal with, an informal deal with the Army Corps, where they've got about 2.68, Ben? 2.68? 2.68% of that flood pool is, oh, I'm sorry, 6.82 they're leaving in the flood pool, which means that's free water to us. And we're pulling that water just as fast as we can. Instead of our normal 60% draw out of Cheney, we're going north of 80%, 90%, because that's water that's there. And while it's there, before it evaporates, before it has to be dumped, we're making use of that water. We're making an operational change. Also, that water is on top of our water, so our water is not evaporating. It's protecting our water from evaporation. It's that amount that's above that's being evaporated. So it's a benefit for only a year, but what we're trying to do is to maximize. So there's some flexibility in this 60%, 40%. And as you'll recall, last year, we reversed that. We actually went to a very much higher pull out of the Equus beds because we didn't want Cheney to go dry, because that is then when we basically are no longer able to meet demands. So what we did was we looked at dozens of different new water supply options, and I mean literally dozens. And we did a very high level analysis of them. And what we did was narrow them down to 9 that we thought had enough merit to look at even deeper. These are the 9 that we came up with. What we looked at is the expected yield, how much water we would get from them, how much the capital costs were, and we looked at this simply, only at capital costs, didn't yet factor in operating costs, and what the cost per acre foot was to get some sort of a sense on how to rank them. As you can see, they're ranked 1 through 9 by the cost per acre foot number. Bank storage wells are the highest yield, but $501 million, that's a significant investment. You look at optimized ASR facilities, and we're going to talk in detail about each of these. Optimized ASR facilities, we're still talking about a fairly serious acre foot yield, but a much less capital cost. When you look at raw water from El Dorado to ASR, 14,000 acre feet, that's pretty good, but you're looking at $367 million. Purple pipe, we wanted to take a really good look at purple pipe. That's sewer effluent in a parallel piping system that delivers treated sewer effluent for irrigation for non-drinking, non-potable purposes. That's the lowest in cost, $120 million, but it has a very low yield of only 2,500, and that's mostly because of who would be available to take it, and a lot of it's seasonal. How much you only deliver it during the irrigation season. During the winter, you wouldn't be delivering it. And then treated El Dorado water, that's a good amount, 11,000 acre feet, and in the $16 million, that's our capital cost to be able to take treated water from El Dorado, and we'll talk about that more in detail. So let's take, So of the 9, we narrowed it down to 5 based on annual yield, capital costs, how effective it was, and we chose what we thought were the 5 most promising options. So we narrowed it down from dozens down to 9, did some more analysis, narrowed it from 9 down to 5. The first one, bank storage wells. This is where we put wells in the riverbank downstream from the sewer treatment plant, and we're pulling groundwater out of the water that's fed by the riverbank. It's part of that water system. Part of the water in the river is our treated sewer effluent. So indirectly, we're making use of a water right that becomes available because we're putting water into the river that in some way feeds indirectly the groundwater on the banks of the river that we would then pull. There's some natural filtration that occurs anytime you're putting water through soil, and that's what we're talking about here. We would then take that water, send it through a reverse osmosis treatment plant, an advanced type of treatment plant, to get it to standards well superior to drinking water standards, and then introduce it into our distribution system. What we're talking about is a firm yield of 30,000 acre feet. That's a huge yield. When you figure that The low flows at the treatment plant are 35,000 MGD. That's a very realistic number to be able to get. When you look at the year drought, it ends without any conservation. You could get all the way out to the year 2077, well beyond the 2066 planning period, and be able to protect yourself in a 1% drought, because a 30,000 acre foot is such a big number. And the amount of conservation you'd need, you wouldn't need any. You could do this purely like a blunt hammer on applied to the problem. Just through water supply only and no conservation, we could get well beyond 2060, all the way to the year 2070. But there are some significant costs associated with it. Now, we talked about $510 million for this or $501 million, but we looked at our capital projects, and we would be able to eliminate some already planned, already covered by current rates projects, like the Northwest Treatment Plant. We'd be able to reduce some of those and get the costs down to $418 million. But even that, the construction costs, that would have a one-time equivalent of a one-time rate increase to our customers of 60%. We'd have to raise our rates 60% to be able to cover that capital cost. Here's the other part of it that's very expensive. It would cost us an estimated $17 million a year to operate that reverse osmosis treatment plant, because of the filters have to be replaced regularly, and mostly it's electricity costs, very high electricity costs. Just the ongoing, if we could get the treatment plant built for us for free, just the operating costs would require us to do a one-time rate increase, equivalent of a one-time rate increase of 20.7%. You're looking at an 80.7% impact to our ratepayers to look at something like this, unless we were to bring some sort of capital source, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So you see how we consider our conservation, drought, and capital costs and yield all together to kind of tell the story. Number 4 was the next one we looked at. That was optimized ASR facilities. What we would do is we would drill some additional wells, so we could, all the water that when it was available, based on the new information that we have, that we would be able to treat and push it into the ground. We also look at building a parallel pipeline from the well field down to town, because we have a bottleneck, if you will, in our ability to deliver. So we would be building a parallel pipeline right next to the one that we've got now, from the well field down to town, to be able to use this water. The effect of that gives us an increase in 8,000 acre feet of water. If you look at the drought protection, it'd get us out to about 2024 in a 1% drought. But we could get all the way to 2060 for a 1% drought if we had a 0.5% annual year after year decrease in our demand from conservation. 5%, that might be a little at the top end of what's realistic and practical. We'd like to have more information to know, but we're thinking that's starting to push the envelope a little bit. But when you look at the capital costs, $198 million, you're looking at a 28.4% rate increase. The annual costs of $1.6 million would still equate to a 2% increase, for a total of 30.4% rate increase.
Alan, I have a question. On this slide 26 you're on, yeah, okay. I don't know, in the 0.5% annually, that's conservation?
Yes, sir, year after year. Reduction in demand.
So I'm confused on the next part. From 2020, 2060, what's that mean?
So in order, see, you're okay out to about 2024.
Right.
So we'd have to start a few years before 2024 and start looking at having a conservation program that resulted in a reduction in our demand of 0.5% year after year, every year, all the way out to the planning period, for this option to actually help us survive a 1% drought. It's the combination of conservation and the water source that allows you to get through the 1% drought.
So your bet, and the estimate would be it would extend it to 2060 if all things are perfect?
Yes, sir. If you did achieve that 50% and had the 8,000 acre feet, we should be okay all the way out to our planning period, which is 2060. That's as far as our planning period goes, is to the year 2060. Raw water from El Dorado, we looked at this long and hard. That's running the city building a pipeline from El Dorado Reservoir and the necessary appurtenances, pump stations, and the rest, to our ASR facility up north. and then treating it at our underutilized ASR treatment plant asset up there and putting it into the ground. It also includes having the parallel pipeline built. So what you're looking at there is a $367 million project for 14,000 acre feet. That's a pretty good yield, 14,000 acre feet. That gets you all the way out to 2036, but you'd still have to do some conservation to be able to get through a 1% drought all the way to the year 2060. You'd be looking at a 0.26%. Well, we're getting 0.4% out of our last rebate program. We think 0.26% is a realistic conservation target that we could rely on hitting in order for this option to make sense in a 1% drought scenario. When you look at the rate impact, most of that rate impact is from your capital cost, 52.7%. But there is a $4.2 million ongoing additional operating cost that represents a rate impact of 5.1% for a total rate impact of 57.8%. We looked at the purple pipe system, which is just another way of describing a parallel pipeline backbone, if you will, that takes treated sewer effluent from the treatment plant, treated pretty much like to the levels that it is now, and then distributing it to some key places in the city. You don't want to build a completely parallel pipeline system. We don't have enough money to build two water systems, so you kind of pick the ones that are high water, potable water users. You're looking at only the potable use, not those that are already using well water, because you wouldn't want to replace well water with this water, but you'd want to replace potable water. You're looking at industrial users. You're looking at irrigation sites like our parks and golf courses. And when you look at the particularly irrigation, which is only available for part of the year, you wouldn't be delivering that water during non-irrigation systems. You're looking at an expectation to have a firm yield, what would actually be taken, an offset to potable water of 2,500 acre feet. That's not a lot. But look at the, and it only takes you to 2015 in terms of drought protection. But wow, look at the capital. It's only $120 million. That's 17.2%. It's only 1.7% or $1 million in operating costs. That's a 2.1%. That's a 19.3% rate impact compared to others. That's fairly getting down as a lower option in terms of rate impact. However, when you look at the amount of conservation you'd have to put in place to be able to get through a 1% by only adding 2,500 acre feet, offsetting as far as demand, you're looking at numbers that are so big that we have some real serious doubts as to whether you could actually achieve that kind of conservation. This is equivalent to eventually getting to a point where you've removed all outside irrigation water demands, and that you're somehow making up for the little that's being used outside with reductions in people's demands inside their house. Don't know if that's even possible. This is very close to an option we looked at where you add no new supply, no capital costs for any new supply, and that you get through a 1% drought just purely through conservation, no added water supply. Just how much conservation would you need to be able to get to a 1% drought? And it's very close to the numbers that you're looking at here. The difference is that when you look at lost revenue, this would allow us to ease on the conservation amount, where if we did it purely through conservation, remember that lost revenue we were talking about, over that period of time between now and 2060, you'd be looking at over $1 billion in lost revenue. Doing this purely through conservation and no water supply is going to have the unwanted economic effect of a huge amount of lost revenue over the planning period. So although this looks good as far as rate impact, there is some real question about whether it's even achievable, the conservation that you'd have to do to be able to make it work in a 1% drought. Then we looked at treated water from El Dorado. We've been in conversations with El Dorado about the possibility of them delivering water to the city and charging us so much per 1,000 gallons or some sort of an amount like that. So in this particular option, what we're looking at is them delivering water to our system. What we would look at is if there was some non-utility capital funding that we could give them to pay for their treatment plant expansion and pay for their building the pipeline and the pump station, that they could provide us with water at no charge for some period of time. We'd have to negotiate that with them. If we didn't provide that capital income, they would have to make it up in an amount per 1,000 gallons. They've quoted us, given us an offer last year of $5 to $6 per 1,000 gallons. If you take the low end, $5 per 1,000 gallons, then what you're looking at is to pay for that extra water year after year. And it's a take or pay. You have to pay it whether you use it or not. That's about an $18.3 million bump in our costs to do that. So you pay them either by helping them offset their capital costs, or you pay them through increased cost per 1,000 gallons. $5 is about double what we charge our customers per 1,000 gallons. You're talking about 11,000 acre feet. If we were to be able to provide them with this capital offset, we're talking about 3% rate impact. This would get us all the way out to 2030. That's pretty respectable. And when you look at what you need to add to that with conservation, now you're talking about a 0.35%. That's definitely in the realm of doable. We could do a 0.35% reduction in demand through conservation. Capital costs, we put $16 million in there. That may be on the high side, but what that does is that pays for the infrastructure we're going to have to build on our side of the pipeline to be able to accept the water. A chlorine booster station, pump station, some storage, that sort of thing. There's a 2.3% impact on that. If you have an annual amount of operating costs, we're still looking at operating a new water source coming into our system, about $0.6 million, but only a 0.7% rate impact. So how do you sort all this out? We thought it might be useful for us to put them up side by side now that you have kind of the detail of each. You're looking at option 1, 4, 5, 8, and 9 described in the way that we just did. You're looking at their firm yields associated with each. You look at the capital costs. That's the capital cost for the project. But if we could find some non-utility capital funds, whether that's in capital improvement plan or some sort of a source of non-utility funds, an amount of not to exceed $250 million, or something that matches the actual capital costs. What you're looking at is option 1 and option 5 still require some capital costs. When you look at the revised capital rates, you're looking at something in the neighborhood of 24% for the bank storage wells to 0% in some of the ones that are fully funded by this non-utility capital fund. Still have an operating cost, though, that you have to factor in there, and you're looking here anywhere between 0.7 to 5, 20%. That factors into it. So with a total rate increase for both capital and operating, you can see how they kind of rank towards each other, with the lowest being treated water from El Dorado. Without that funding, we wanted to show that if we didn't, yes, sir. I'm sorry.
That's right. You want to finish? Councilmember Longwell's got some questions.
Well, going back to the treated water from El Dorado, that gets a little confusing why those costs are so low. The reality is the $18.3 million in costs associated with that an annual event? They would have to make up that $18.3 million?
Yes, sir. That's an ongoing increased cost that we'd have to pay for that water.
So the reality is, if you're truly trying to compare apples to apples, you could say if we could find a non-utility capital funding stream for some of the other plans, then you would have similar reductions.
That's the error in the slide, and I thought about that too late to get that incorporated, so you had that exact apple-to-apple comparison. That's correct. But I think and we will make that adjustment. We have recommendations on how we're going to go forward. We'll make that adjustment so you've got that rate impact, but you're right.
That apples-to-apples, side-by-side comparison is presented in this slide here.
Okay.
So we show each of the options with that extra capital offset so that you can compare apples to apples. You're right, that last slide, in keeping in the spirit of the previous slides,
right,
really should have had a cost for us to build the infrastructure and put it in place ourselves.
Right.
Or at least incorporate the
offsetting costs associated with it.
Yes, sir, exactly.
One more question. When you look at the bank storage wells, which is pretty impressive with the amount of acre square feet that you could get, don't you still lose some to underground migrations? And I don't know if you calculated how much loss you have there. And then secondly, when you're looking at that $17 million annual operating cost in addition, have we looked at alternative energy supplies? Because I think you mentioned the majority of that 17 million is in energy. And I don't know if we could install our own windmill out there in the country and be able to knock down that $17 million energy bill, or some other alternative energy supply that might get that down.
In your first question, it does take into effect what we would think that we would be able to pull out of the bank storage wells. That is a number that takes into consideration loss, recharge, all the rest. As far as the ongoing operating costs, that very high cost, it's two big ticket items, one being electricity, one being these filters are very expensive and they have to be replaced every 3 to 5 years. That's what that made up. We didn't go into the level of refinement that you're suggesting as far as looking at ways to trim the energy costs by bringing on our own energy. That would certainly be a refinement that we could do at your direction.
Thank you.
Alan, I know you're still in the middle of your presentation, but since we're taking questions right now, I wanted to ask, on the water right side of things, when we dump water into the river, we don't lose the right to that water, is what you're saying? We actually bank rights, the water right, or gain extra water rights because we're putting that water back?
That's correct, sir. That's our water. We're not required to put it into the river. Because of where the source of the water is, we retain rights over that water. It just simply goes downstream right now. We could take that water and treat it as a water source to drinking water standards. That was one of the 9 that didn't make it to the final 5. But we have the rights. That's our water. However, when you're starting to pull it out of the banks, you have to convert that direct water right to that groundwater water right. It's just a formality, and it's every one of these have some things that might be a problem associated with it. Just bring that to you right now that there's permitting uncertainties and all the rest with all of these, but you'd be required to do to get a water right from those bank storage wells. But what we would do to support that is, hey, we've got water going down the river that actually goes into the soil.
I just had some concern. I meet with a group of engineers every month, and we talk about various issues. And actually, we talked about this at our last meeting, and there was some concern that we would lose that water right, and that. So I guess my question is, we've verified that with the state of Kansas that water right doesn't go away, and that since we put it there, we have a right to it. I mean, if we were to go with option 1.
Yes, sir. That was one of the fatal flaws that we identified early before we even included that in that. When we look at those dozens of different options, and because one of the water sources is Cheney outside of that drainage basin for where we're talking about where we're putting into the river, and the other water source is groundwater, because of where we pull the water, we're not required to have a return into the river. We can take all of it. Now, there may be some environmental issues when it came time to get permits to say, looking at minimum stream flows and effects on habitats and that sort of thing. But purely from a water rights standpoint, that would be something that we could pursue.
I could imagine not putting the water in the river or taking it from groundwater around the river could cause some significant anxiety to cities and maybe even a state that's to the south of us that depend on that water that we send down there. And I guess I'm assuming everybody's thought of those issues and that there's an answer for that. How many, in going to the El Dorado option, how many other municipalities or rural water districts depend on El Dorado right now as a water source? And if we find ourselves in a drought, how is that going to impact El Dorado? It was down significantly as well. How does that impact us?
Answer to your first question, I know that there are others. I don't know who they are or how many. I can get that information for you.
I think that's pretty important if we're going to be pulling 11 million acre feet of water from El Dorado a day. I'm assuming that's a day.
It's 11,000 acre feet a year.
11,000 a year.
Right, and so you're looking at something. If we were to pull it day by day, you'd be looking at 10 million gallons a day. We would want to have the pipeline built in such a way that sometimes we could take 30 million gallons a day, and sometimes take none. But if you look at the overall amount that we would be pulling, it would be an equivalent to 10 million gallons per day every day, and there would be a take or pay provision where if we didn't take the water, we'd still have to pay for it. In talking with the folks at El Dorado, they've expressed that they're confident that they can provide us with that amount of water all the way down to where the drought takes them, and they're basing that on their drought history and their readings in the reservoir levels. The devil's in the details. We'd have to make sure that we made that as part of the agreement between us and El Dorado, that we could have some assurances of being able to take that water.
With all due respect to El Dorado, we also thought that Cheney was going to take us out another 30 years as well, and we found out that that wasn't the case. And so if we're going to start taking 10 million gallons from El Dorado, and I understand El Dorado probably really wants us to start buying water from them. It's a good deal for them. I would really hope that we could get a third-party look at whether or not what their current demand is and adding 10 more million gallons a day or whatever that ends up being, that actually is, they're going to be able to withstand another, we just had a 3-year drought, and we were really in a bad position. So that's something that I hope that we're really considering. And then last thing that I'm going to say, at least for right now, is there are other countries and other states that are doing reuse initiatives that they don't look like what we are looking at for reuse. Some of them are indirect, some of them are direct reuse. Have we looked at countries like Israel or Colorado or what they're doing in Orange County and Wichita Falls, which was also presented? What are they doing that's different from us than what we've presented?
Well, there are examples in the country of indirect reuse and reuse in the sense of using it for non-potable use. That's fairly understood and mature and used in a lot of places across the country. Israel, they reuse their treated sewer not to potable standards, but they do apply it to food crops. And most of their sewer effluent is used. Very little of it actually returns back into the rivers and streams, and it's used for agricultural purposes. That's also something that's being used across the country, non-potable use of reuse water, use of reuse. And then there's the indirect, where you put it into a lagoon first, or here's a good example of indirect potable reuse is the one that you just cited earlier in your concern about some of the downstream users depending on the stream flows for their water supply. Guess what a lot of that stream flow is? It's our sewer effluent. That's a kind of reuse that maybe isn't quite as well understood, but most rivers have users downstream who are taking water out of the river downstream from a sewer treatment plant that's putting water into the river. Having said that, there are still very stringent standards in intentionally taking reuse from one of your treatment plants and using it for potable uses. They are doing, California is a good example. Texas is now, Wichita Falls is looking at, I think it's Wichita Falls, one of the Texas cities, is looking at it on a temporary basis. There are no examples here in Kansas. There's desalinization out of Hutchinson where they're pulling brackish water and treating it through reverse osmosis. But it would require that we get some drinking water standards defined on what we would have to meet through the state to be able to do what we're talking about here. We've been in conversations with senior staff at the state, and what they've said is, we can come up with something. We're not there yet. If it comes to a point where we need to come up with something, we'll probably look very hard at what California is doing. We looked at what California's standards are, and we could achieve those sorts of standards with the kind of technology we're presenting here to council today.
Hold off more questions right now. I'll let you continue.
I'm close to the end of my part of it.
I appreciate it.
I know I've blown past the half hour probably, but...
Did that an hour ago.
Oh, man.
Not really.
When you look at next steps...
Wait,
yes, sir, I'm
one
sorry.
more question from
Yes.
Councilmember Blueball.
Yes, sir.
I believe earlier we talked about the purchase price from El Dorado. Did you say $5 per 1,000 gallons?
Yes, sir. That would be one way to do it, is if we didn't provide them with some non-utility capital funding up front, they would have to recover that capital expense through the amount that they sold us the water for, which is a range. We got an offer letter from them, a range of $5 to $6 per 1,000 gallons.
Please be careful with that number. That was an opening
Yes.
position. We're still in the middle of discussions with them. That is not locked in, and as we move forward, we're going to refine options, and that will be one of the things we'll continue to work with them on.
But you did say that was double the price. That wholesale price is double what we charge our customers.
We charge roughly, if you wanted to look at something to compare it to, ours is about $2.50 per 1,000 gallons.
So what does that look like on obviously we can't buy it for that and sell it to the city of Wichita residents at a 50% loss. I mean, what would that look like as a rate? Or is that
Again,
something you're saying
Again, let's not focus on that number. That's just a starting point from discussions with them. And we've evolved over a period of time to actually get away from that to get to the concept that is outlined here in option 9. And we just had the $5 as a placeholder, but I can tell you with some certainty it will not come in at $5.
Okay. But if we do go forward with some of the capital cost, it will reduce that dramatically?
Yes, that was $5 solely if they did it all on their own, had to cover all capital costs and operating costs plus charges for the right to that water. So that's all inclusive.
And I know you're trying to steer away from that, but do we have any kind of ballpark if we do come up with that capital cost? Well, what would we be looking at per 1,000?
I feel like I'm in a congressional hearing. Again, we're in the process of negotiation with El Dorado, and I can't tell you for sure at this point. We are moving forward in a very productive way, and I think when he gets to his recommendation slide, he'll tell you what our next steps are.
Thanks.
So next steps, we would like to refine our water source options. Some of the poor people that we had that were along on the journey with us, I'm thinking most notably the task force out of the chamber, and you'll be hearing from them next. They were along the ride with us as we did our very preliminary estimates, our not so preliminary estimates, our just preliminary estimates. These numbers changed so much. We think we've got a fairly good set of numbers now, but we really would like to continue to refine some of our water source options. We'd like to do that effort on what could be considered the 2 best options to consider, and perhaps that's from additional work, perhaps that's from direction from council. We'd like to identify what our goals are for conservation, to figure out what is the right match and what is the probability of achieving our goals for conservation. And what we'd like to do is, with council's permission, come back perhaps in May with a white paper that summarizes our results and gives much more in-depth questions or answers to questions like the one brought up by Councilmember Longwell on offsetting costs, for example, on some of these options. So that would be our recommended next steps.
Alan, you're saying that, so a white paper on these 5 choices?
If that's the council's pleasure, it would be it would be our preference if we could narrow it down to 2.
Okay.
I don't know if that's possible, but if that is possible, that would be our preference. We can do a lot better job in drilling down and getting the technical aspects of it nailed down. So we've got another part of this presentation. We were fortunate enough to be participants in an effort. Councilmember Miller was part of that, and I don't know how fortunate you might have felt sitting through that, but they asked a lot of really good questions, help us think more clearly about what it was we were trying to achieve. And this water task force actually came up with some recommendations, and with your permission, I'd like to have them come up and make a presentation on their recommendations.
Okay. I'll have you know the media did an over-under bet on the 30 minutes, and we lost that. Thanks, Bill.
Hello, my name is Karma Mason. I am a small business owner, and my husband and I own ISI Environmental. We are members of the chamber, and I was asked to help support with the water task force and going through an evaluation of what options the city has moving forward with establishing a long-term water supply strategy and possibly to even discuss some funding options. As you'll see on the slide, that is the goal of the Water Task Force. As you've already heard, and as we all experienced a year ago, we were in a not so great place. You know, we were seeing the pictures of Cheney Lake at one of the lowest points I think a lot of us had seen, if not the lowest in our lifetimes. And it was a good wake-up call. As a result, business leaders in the community expressed concerns and had discussions with the chamber. And Gary Plummer, president of the chamber, took it upon himself to engage with the city to come up with a plan to pull together a task force. And Council Member Janet Miller, as Alan said, was part of that. The city manager participated in those task force meetings. Alan King, I think, was present at every single one of those to talk us through the complexities of the issues. The task force was comprised of other, and there we go, other members. It was a public and private group of people and representing various entities besides the city as well. We had some state level representatives, and we had some representatives from Senator Moran's office as well as Congressman Pompeo's office participate. And you can see the names of the people that participated there, and I'm sure a lot of them are very familiar to you. This was a very complex issue for this group to face. Some of us had been in water for a while in our professional lives. All of us are certainly users of water, but some of us were not that familiar with the complexity of all the issues. And I really have to give credit to the city, Alan King in particular, and to the city manager for their willingness to share information as it became available to them. The process began, the first meeting was in September, and that process didn't conclude until, as you see on your handout, it concluded on March 10th. It was a lengthy process. It actually extended longer than we thought it would due to the complexity of the issues and the level of education that we as a group needed to go through, but also in sifting through the information that the city was sharing with us. And as Alan said, you know, they shared preliminary information with us for which, you know, I am most thankful because it helped to generate the right kinds of conversation. But it is a moving target. The city continues to vet that information and to evaluate it. And I saw some things from Alan today that shows that they're continuing in that process. So please understand that you know, this is a moving target, and I will then move forward now to talk about really what we came up with. Through our various conversations and meetings, 4 elements came out as common themes of the discussion, and we think that they're critical to any long-term water supply solution. And that is, you know, education of the public on what the city is doing and why. Certainly conservation is a huge piece of that, and we're heavily supportive of significant conservation, as well as identifying new sources and looking for opportunities for water reuse. You saw some of the cost factors. Some of those costs are coming down as evaluation continues. And when we first started looking at it, the cost ranged from, for these 9 elements, from $288 million to over $800 million. So we are seeing some adjustment of the costing as the evaluation process continues. So as far as the funding options piece of our goal, I do want to tell this group that in our recommendations you won't see any pertaining to funding. Some of that is due to the fact that we knew that these dollars were moving with the evaluation. And for us to come up with a recommendation for funding, we felt very ill-equipped when we didn't know, one, what option would pop out as the most viable option and what the cost of that option would be. But the Chamber does want to remain engaged and be able to weigh in as appropriate as that information becomes available. The Water Task Force essentially recommends that whatever strategy the city looks at, the cost effectiveness element is critical. We cannot, fund essentially $800 million water projects on any routine basis. So certainly looking at a cost-effective way is critical. So as I move forward, I'm going to discuss the actual recommendations that we came up with. Earlier you heard Alan talk about a 1% and 2% drought scenarios. The state requires each public water supply to do its conservation planning based on a 2% drought scenario. That's the state requirement. Our group concurred that the city should use a 2% drought scenario for its planning. It isn't always real clean, the difference between 1% and 2%, but a lot of the 1% drought scenario planning is very costly, so we're recommending a 2%. Along with the 2% drought planning, we are encouraging the city to pursue aggressive conservation measures, and that will include looking at the rate structure. Alan already talked a little bit about that and talked about some of the challenges that the city has once you start implementing significant conservation measures, and it really puts a pinch on your revenues to cover your basic costs. So we're saying that look at establishing a rate structure that covers those fixed costs and that rewards conservation. Also, we encourage the city to look at what it's doing with landscaping and what it's doing to encourage landscaping by the public, so that the public leans more towards the drought-tolerant plants and is receptive to lawn watering restrictions. We also think that there is significant benefit to have a reward incentive program for conservation. Alan mentioned that there is a drought plan in place, and I have heard several months ago that you guys evaluated a drought plan and approved it, but nobody's seen that drought plan. I haven't seen it. Other people haven't seen it. We need to be prepared to implement that, but we need to communicate what's in that drought plan so the public is prepared to deal with it. Now we come to some of the concrete recommendations that we're making. We looked at the 9 different options, and one of them that really popped out as favored by the group for multiple reasons was the purchase of raw water from El Dorado. We did a pro and con study on this, and the raw water from El Dorado ticked a lot of the positive boxes. One of them being that you have some flexibility when you bring raw water from El Dorado. You don't have to put it directly into your potable water and distribute it to the population. You can take the raw water and either send it to the treatment plant and put it into your distribution, or you can look at supplementing the ASR with that water. And it was our understanding that some of the functionality of the ASR needs to be tied to more days with water available to use the ASR system. So that was one of the key points with the raw water from El Dorado. It allows the city of Wichita to bank water in the aqueous beds. Another recommendation that popped out was that it's pretty critical that the city looks seriously at partnering with large industrial users, developers, and others to facilitate water reuse. The use of gray water or the treated groundwater from Gilbert and Mosley or other reuse opportunities. We really encourage that the city look seriously at those types of partnerships. And through the discussion, we're a little bit like this group, when we saw the dollars for the indirect potable reuse, it looked pretty attractive to us. And it really stimulated a lot of conversation within that group, and I have to say that it was accepted by that group as a very attractive new water supply. I think we all understand the challenge that we have when you start looking at indirect potable reuse, but one of you council members was asking questions about what other parts of the country and other parts of the world are doing, and they are doing this. And we've got it ready and available, and it probably wouldn't be that difficult to implement. Moving on, we think it's critical that the city commit to educating its population on what it's doing and aggressively conduct a PR, a public relations campaign, regarding your drought plan, the conservation plan, and efforts for reuse. The public understands, I think you saw with the outreach that the city did, that the public understands that water is a priority issue, and I think that we can share all of this with the public, and I think they will understand the complexity of the issue and understand moving forward. And we need to continue to identify new regional water supply options. That's ongoing. The recommendations that we've made, could be a blend, could be sequential. You're not going to do one and solve all your issues. You're going to have to look at a combination of them. I appreciate the opportunity to present the findings of the Water Task Force, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Karma, thanks. I didn't have any idea that was the size of the task force. How'd you get them all to get on the same page?
Well, we had a lot of meetings, and we didn't all agree.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody have any questions for Carmen? Well, I know you've got a great resume in this deal, and thanks for your leadership and agreeing to do that. Thanks for your comments, too. And we'll keep in touch. I thought maybe our conservation plan, going back to one of your statements, I thought that was I thought we did that publicly.
The conservation plan is, but I haven't been able to see the drought plan.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
We did approve that publicly, but I think it may have been an oversight on our part that we didn't, and maybe it wasn't even done. I can't remember when we did that, if we did it during the time the task force was meeting or not. Anyway, we do need to get it to you.
Yeah, I don't think there's any intent on.
No, because we approved that at a council meeting at some point, but I've slept since then and I can't remember when it is, so I apologize for that.
Were you up in Topeka this weekend?
Thank you.
Okay. Back at the task at hand, does anybody want to take a stab at trying to narrow 5 down to 2 or 3?
Mr. Vice Mayor, we're just looking for any initial questions and feedback. We're going to take on that task of getting it down to 2 for you.
Okay. Councilmember Clendenin has a comment.
Bob, I know that several years ago, and I think it was around 2007, 2008, there was a reuse plan that was done by, I think, a third party. And I think the city may have even paid for that. I don't know. Has that plan been consulted in our? I'm assuming it has, but I'm just trying to cover.
Councilmember Clendenin, you may be referring to a study that was done to look at the possibility of treated sewer effluent for Spirit Airline or Spirit Company. They were looking at that time to make use of the treated water or the treated sewer effluent, and there were some different routings that were suggested, some cost estimates that were put together. We've since that time been in conversations with Spirit. We've refined that estimate. We've also looked at another option, which is for them to take the water from the Gilmo the groundwater cleanup efforts that we're doing. It results in water that we're just dumping right now, and that together with the future water we'll be cleaning up in the NIC project, they've been looking at the possibility of using that water. And so we've been in conversations with them. That study you're talking about has been updated, and we've done additional work since that time.
So this wasn't I was under the impression it was a study done about city reuse, not, is that, I might be mistaken, so. No, okay.
I'm getting a head shake no from my staff.
I got some wrong information then. To me, that seems to be very predictable water source, and I know that there are some challenges along with that, but I hope that there is some weight put in that direction as far as our two options. So,
Again, I think Karma said it best, and that is whatever we do will be incremental over a period of time. The difficulty with that, of course, is the technology today and the cost of reverse osmosis, regardless of whether you take it directly or indirectly. And again, we're trying to manage the capital expenses and the ongoing expenses with this next approach. And we're trying to be sensitive to rates and other funding sources. So when we come to you, there'll be some rationale for what we're doing, but recognize again, as technology changes, as our need changes, this is probably evolutionary, and I'm sure staff and council members of the future will be wrestling with this as we go forward.
well, I think that really is a concern of mine with it. We say, hey, look, we've fixed our water problem. Now let's put it on a shelf, let it get dusty, and not pay attention to it anymore. And I think this just needs to be an ongoing effort from year to year to continue to look at what options are available for us and how technology is changing. So this is just a comment I had. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Miller.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we could have some interim report, and maybe it's just to us individually, about which two you're going to focus on, narrow in on, and why. At least so we could have that before you go all the way down the road on those two. It would be terrible if we went through all of, you got it down to two, and then you spent all that time doing the white paper and came back to us and we said, yeah, well, we kind of think you should have looked at this other one.
On a preliminary basis, based on capital expenses, rate impact, and potential resources available, if you were to ask us today the direction we'd be headed, it would probably be to refine the costs associated with options 4 and 9. Those appear to be the most manageable and cost-effective from where we are today.
Say that again, Bob?
Options 4 and 9, I believe. Is that right? That would be based on the results as well as the costs and the funding impacts. But we still have work to do in those on both of those options, and if we were to refine those further and find that we were moving in the wrong direction, we would look at probably another option.
I have a question as well. On option 8, which is the purple pipe, how come that's called purple? That's not my question. Anyway.
Because purple's the greatest color in the world.
Oh, every man a wildcat. Okay, 18 industrial, 13 higher irrigation customers, right? So the rate impact of 17.2%, that's on all the rate payers?
Yeah, yes.
Part of our consideration that we approached the 18 and 13 to see how much of that 120 million they would be interested in?
I'll do an initial response and let Alan refine that. We've been working with Spirit, exploring an alternative, as Alan said, they are not able to make it cost-effective if they have to bear the full capital expense and pay the full share of that water processing. So the only way for this option to work is that the cost has to be spread across all the ratepayers, because the benefit should accrue to the system, not just to those users.
Okay, but that Spirit couldn't handle just their portion, or you asked Spirit if they would do the whole 120 million?
No, they couldn't handle in their case, we're looking at another source, which is from the Gilbert and Mosley water treatment.
Okay.
And they could not pay for, in a cost-effective way, they could not pay for the full capital costs associated with that, and could not pay the cost of, in that case, the processing of water was not a big issue. But if you look at the capital cost and the ongoing operating expenses with the purple pipe, you cannot have the end users pay their fair share and make it cost effective. Golf courses, for instance, couldn't pay, the golf courses we've talked to could not pay their capital expense and the cost of water as we would propose it.
Okay. There's a handful of questions here. I'm not sure I had the right order here, but we'll start with Councilmember Williams.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Bob, do we have an idea of the time frame that we plan to accomplish this task?
Yes, we would plan on bringing it to you in early May, along with the other white papers that you've asked for, okay. 8 of those. Probably would have multiple meetings to get through all 8.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Longwell?
When you're looking at the different options and you're trying to compare apples to apples, I would also encourage you to look at, in those options, need to answer that? That's your mother calling?
He doesn't know.
Nice song, though.
You can step out if you need to. Heidi-ho.
I would encourage you to also look at a couple of things. I mean, it appears that you're kind of basing the non-utility capital expense of somewhere around $198 million ballpark, with the exception of option 8. And if you're comparing the non-utility capital expenses and you're trying to compare them all evenly, then some of the options that don't have as much money in capital costs, like option 8, then you ought to bury the rest of that in offsetting water cost or annual increases, just like you were offsetting annual increases by buying down the cost of water. That makes sense? Because in option 9, the only reason why you have a 0.7% rate impact is because you bought down the cost of water. So you ought to do the same for those others that don't use the full $198 million.
The reason we did that in option 9 is because you have a new cost of water associated with that. And we needed to offset that cost. And
I get that. Otherwise, your rate impact would have been significantly more. I understand that. I'm just saying.
What you would be saying that is option 8, that you would reduce rates in.
That 2.1 would come down because you're going to use the balance of that non-utility capital to buy that rate down. Similar to the way that you're buying option 9 rate down if you're comparing apples to apples.
We could do that. You would still not get what you need in terms of the water reduction conservations.
I totally get that.
Okay.
I'm just saying to compare apples to apples when we're looking at real dollars. If you're going to buy the rate down for one and the other has some money available to buy the rate down for it to keep it equal, we ought to at least look at those numbers. And then I'm just assuming then if we buy that rate down with non-utility capital monies, that there's going to be some kind of agreement long-term that we're not paying excess amount of dollars, that the water we buy in future years will be less expensive than the $5. So that's my concern. Just want to make sure that we're looking at numbers that we can easily compare.
Councilmember Bluebonnet, did you have?
Yeah. Do we know what that future demand is? Or do we have a forecast for the future demand?
As far as the total demand on our system, yeah, if you look at, let me get a slide here that might be helpful. If you look at either slide 11 or slide 9, either of those have the same demand line. And that black line represents our projection of what the demand will be. Shall I get to it? There we go. That's the same demand line that we show on all of our demand supply graphs. That's the squiggly line you see to the left. That's actual demand in each of those years. You can see there's quite a bit of variability in that, and that's because you have some years are wet years and you don't have a lot of demand, and some years are high demand years because they're dry and people are doing a lot of irrigation. What we try to do is we try to get a bound, an upward bound and a lower bound at the 90% certainty level, and that's what you see, that heavy dashed line to the right of the number 2011 and the dotted line. Your demand is going to be somewhere in between those, that upper and lower band, with the kind of the medium demand being that smooth line off into the future. So as you can see, we're somewhere around 60-ish thousand or 1,000 acre feet, and by the time you get to per year. By the time you get out to the year 2060, that number has gone up considerably. Now that demand reflects not only the growth in Wichita, expected growth in Wichita, but also in the metropolitan area. Those other customers that we serve, we got in touch with them to look at their growth projection numbers for that. So that's for total service area, everyone we provide service to now. That number is a little bit lower than previous demands, and I think it reflects more accurately what the actual demand has been. So that's the demand line that we're using in our analysis. Did that answer your question, Councilmember?
Yeah, where I was going with it, is there potential that, say we did go with 4 and 9 to look at, is there potential you'd eventually need both of those to meet demand?
Yeah, you go far enough into the future. If we're going to continue to grow, you would expect that the demand would also continue to grow. So you go far enough into the future with growth, you're going to outgrow anything that you have.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions unless anybody does. Been a lot of information. Thank you, Alan. Thanks those that have been in the audience to support or to hear this out. So we've got a challenge ahead of us, no question. So with that, we will end the workshop. Everybody have a safe and productive week.